Genocide is an intentional action to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in a whole or in a part. It also involves a coordinated plan of different actions that aims to destruct the essential foundation of the life of the targeted group. Factors that contribute to the rise of genocide includes the ethnic tensions, political instability, dehumanization of the target group, and the presence of authoritarian regime that willing to use their extreme measures to maintain their power. Genocide had occurred throughout the human history from the colonization of Americans to the Holocaust, Rwandan genocide, and the ongoing persecution of Rohingya in Myanmar. Factors that contribute to the rise of genocide includes the ethnic tensions, political instability, dehumanization of the target group, and the presence of authoritarian regime that willing to use their extreme measures to maintain their power. So I have here three examples of genocide or global genocide. The first is the Holocaust genocide, second is Rwanda genocide, and the last is the ongoing persecution of Rohingya in Myanmar. The Holocaust genocide is a systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people by the Nazi regime in Germany during the World War II. It is also known as the well-known and devastating genocide in the history. While the Rwanda genocide, it is known as a mass killing of Tutsi moderate of Hutu people by Hutu extremists in Rwanda in 1994, resulting in the death of estimated 800,000 people. So our for last example is the ongoing persecution of Rohingya in Myanmar. It is the systematic discrimination, displacement, and murder of Rohingya Muslim minority group in Myanmar by the country military forces, which has been described as genocide by the United Nations.
So next is the genocide of indigenous peoples, a worldwide phenomenon. So first is the colonization and displacement. The colonization of indigenous lands by foreign powers has often led to the displacement, forced assimilation, and even extermination of indigenous populations. This has happened in the Americas, Australia, and many other parts of the world. Colonizers often took over indigenous lands, forcing people to leave their homes and traditional territories. Colonizers tried to make indigenous peoples adapt the colonizers' culture, language, and the way of life, often suppressing indigenous traditions and beliefs. In some cases, colonization led to the deliberate killing of indigenous people, either through violence or through policies that caused disease and famine. This happened in many parts of the world, including the Americas, Australia, and Africa. Next is loss of culture and identity. The genocide of indigenous peoples has also resulted in the destruction of their unique cultures, languages, and ways of life. This culture genocide has had a devastating impact on the identity and well-being of indigenous communities. Genocide not only involves killing people but also destroying their cultural heritage. This includes their languages, traditions, beliefs, and ways of life. The loss of culture has a profound impact on indigenous people's sense of identity and belonging. It can lead to feelings of alienation, loss, and grief. The destruction of indigenous cultures has a negative impact on their overall well-being. It can contribute to poverty, social problems, and mental health issues. This cultural genocide has had a lasting and devastating impact on indigenous communities around the world. And next is the ongoing struggles. Even today, many indigenous communities continue to face discrimination, land grabs, and attempts to assimilation as governments and corporations seek to exploit their resources and lands. So indigenous peoples still face discrimination in many areas, including education, healthcare, and employment. Governments and corporations continue to take over indigenous lands, often without their consent, to exploit natural resources. Attempts to force indigenous people to assimilate into mainstream society continue, leading to the erosion of their cultures and languages. These challenges demonstrate that the legacy of colonization continues to affect indigenous communities today. The Lumad are the indigenous peoples of the southern Philippines with a rich cultural heritage and deep connection to their ancestral lands. They have faced persecution, displacement, and even extrajudicial killings at the hands of the Philippine government and the paramilitary groups. The Lumad are the indigenous peoples of the southern Philippines, known for their rich cultural heritage and strong connection to their ancestral lands. The Lumad have faced persecution, displacement, and even extrajudicial killings from the Philippine government and paramilitary groups. These actions threaten their way of life and their very existence. The situation highlights the ongoing struggle for indigenous rights and the need for protection and recognition of their unique cultures and traditions. Next is the land grabbing and exploitation. Corporations and the military have targeted Lumad lands for mining, logging, and other resource extraction activities, often forcibly displacing the indigenous communities and destroying their way of life. Corporations and the military are exploiting lumad lands in the Philippines for resources like mining and logging. This often involves forcibly removing lumad communities from their ancestral lands, destroying their traditional way of life, and violating their human rights. The military has been heavily involved, often acting as security for corporations and even supporting paramilitary groups that harass and intimidate Lumad's communities. This has resulted in displacement, killings, and the erosion of nomad culture and livelihoods, leaving them vulnerable and marginalized. Resistance and advocacy. Despite the ongoing challenges, the Lumad people have continued to resist and advocate for their rights, forming grassroots organizations and partnering with international human rights groups to bring attention to their plight. Despite the ongoing challenges and threats they face, the Lumad people have shown remarkable resilience and continue to fight for their rights. They have formed grassroots organizations to mobilize their communities and advocate for their interests. These organizations provide a platform for collective action and amplify their voices. The Lumad have also partnered with international human rights groups to raise awareness about their plight and seek support for their cause. These partnerships help to bring their struggle to a wider audience and put pressure on governments and corporations to respect their rights. The Lumad people's resistance demonstrates their determination to protect their lands, cultures, and livelihoods. Their activism serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of supporting indigenous rights and advocating for justice. And next is the need for action. The genocide of the Lumad and other indigenous Filipinos underscores the urgent need for greater international attention and action to protect the rights and well-being of indigenous communities around the world. This statement highlights the dire situation of the Lumad and other indigenous Filipinos, calling for urgent international action to protect their rights. It also serves as a call to action urging the international community to recognize the gravity of the situation and take steps to protect indigenous communities from violence, displacement, and cultural erosion.
The lasting impacts of genocide on indigenous communities. First is trauma and mental health challenges. Survivors of genocide often grapple with long term psychological trauma, including PTSD or depression and anxiety, which can have profound impact on their well being and ability to rebuild their lives. It means that genocide leaves deep psychological scars on survivors who often face severe mental health issues like post traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, depression, and anxiety. These conditions affect their emotional well being, relationship, and ability to function in society. Survivors may struggle with guilt, grief, and nightmares, making it difficult to rebuild their lives after experiencing such profound atrocities. The trauma can also ripple across generations, with descendants of survivors inheriting emotional and psychological burdens. This trauma often hinders their ability to rebuild lives and maintain functional communities. For example, in the Philippines, the Moro and indigenous peoples, or the Lumad, and Mindanao have faced violent displacement and massacres during the martial law era under Ferdinand Marcos. The psychological impact of these events continues to affect survivors, their descendants, with many still struggling to heal from the emotional scars of past atrocities. Second is loss of cultural identity. The destruction of indigenous cultures and traditions through genocide can lead to a profound sense of loss and disorientation, making it challenging for communities to maintain their unique identities and pass them on the future generation. It means that genocide targets not only individuals but also collective identity of indigenous communities. The deliberate destruction of cultural symbols, traditions, languages, and practice leads to a loss of heritage and a sense of belonging. This erasure leaves survivors and their descendants struggling to reconnect with or preserve their cultural roots. Without their cultural identity, it becomes harder for these communities to maintain a cohesive sense of who they are, which is essential for their resilience and unity. This loss creates a sense of disorientation and makes it difficult to pass on cultural knowledge to future generations. In the Philippines, the Lumad communities have experienced cultural erosion due to violent attacks on their schools and communities, particularly during mining and logging expansions. The destruction of indigenous schools disrupts their education systems, which is deeply tied to their cultural leaving many young Lumans disconnected from their heritage. The third is economic and environmental devastation. Genocide often results in the displacement of indigenous communities from their ancestral lands, disrupting their traditional livelihoods and cause lasting damage to the natural environments they depend on for survival. It means that genocide often forces indigenous communities of their ancestral lands, severing their ties to the resources and environments that sustain their way of life. The destruction of these lands disrupts their traditional economies, such as farming, hunting, and fishing, leading to widespread poverty and hardship. Additionally, the environmental damage caused by conflict or exploitation often leaves to land barren or uninhabitable, making it nearly impossible for these communities to return their traditional way of living. This displacement and devastation create a long-term economic struggles and environmental challenges that hinder recovery. In the Philippines, large-scale mining operations and ancestral domains have led to deforestation, water pollution, and loss of agricultural land, which significantly affects the livelihoods of indigenous groups like the Manobo or the Aita. The displacements caused by armed conflicts, their economic instability, and environmental challenges, leaving them with a few resources to recover and thrive. Preventing genocide challenges and strategies. First is education and awareness. Raising awareness about the history and dangers of genocide, as well as promoting education in human rights and diversity, are crucial steps in preventing future atrocities. Educating people about the history of genocide and its devastating consequences is critical in preventing future occurrences. Awareness campaigns and educational programs on human rights, diversity, and inclusion foster empathy and understanding among individuals and communities. By learning about the warning signs of genocides and the value of protecting vulnerable groups, societies can build a foundation for vigilance and proactive action. This knowledge empowers individuals to recognize and respond to threats before they escalate. In the Philippines, education initiatives like integrating indigenous peoples or IP, history and rights into school curricula promote awareness of the struggles of indigenous communities such as the Lumad and Aita. For instance, community-driven educational programs emphasize the importance of protecting indigenous cultures and addressing historical injustices to prevent further marginalization or violence against them. Second is diplomatic pressure. It is sustained diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and international intervention can help to deter and stop ongoing acts of genocide. As seen in the case of the Rwandan genocide, so this international diplomacy plays a key role in preventing and addressing genocide. The second is diplomatic pressure. It is sustained diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and international prevention. It can help to deter and stop ongoing acts of genocide, as seen in the case of Rwanda genocide. So this international diplomacy plays key role in preventing and addressing genocide. Actions like imposing economic sanctions or exerting political pressure on governments engaged in human rights abuses can deter further atrocities. Historical cases such as international efforts during the Rwanda genocide demonstrate how internal intervention can save lives. However, sustained efforts are necessary to ensure that the global community acts promptly and decisively to prevent or halt genocidal actions. They signal to perpetrators that the global community does not tolerate such as acts. In the Philippines, in the Philippine context, international attention and pressure have been significant in addressing human rights violations against indigenous communities. For example, advocacy by international organizations has drawn attention to violence against Lumad schools and communities, prompting calls for better government accountability and protection of indigenous rights. Third is accountability and justice. It is holding perpetrators of genocide accountable through international tribunals and courts is essential for deterring future acts and providing a sense of justice for victims and their communities. Bringing those responsible for genocide to justice is vital for both prevention and healing. International courts, such as the International Criminal Court or ICC, ensure that perpetrators are held accountable, sending a strong message that such crimes will not go unpunished. This sense of justice can help victims and survivors find closure while discouraging potential future offenders. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act or the EPRA and related mechanism aims to address injustices against indigenous groups but enforcement often lags. Cases like those involving the forced evacuation of Lumad communities show the needs for the stronger judicial efforts to hold perpetrators accountable for violence and land grabbing. Additionally, this legal processes establish precedents for handling genocide cases, contributing to a global framework for justice. The fourth is protecting indigenous rights. It is strengthening laws and policies to protect the rights of indigenous peoples, including their land rights and cultural practices, can help to prevent the condition that lead to genocides. It is strengthening protection for individuals' communities is an essential strategy to preventing genocide. It is ensuring that these communities have legal rights to their lands, cultural practices, and self-determination. Addresses the systemic marginalization that often precedes genocide. By enacting and enforcing policies that uphold these rights, governments and organizations create an environment where indigenous populations are respected and safeguarded from persecution. This proactive approach helps mitigate the condition that allows genocidal actions to arise. In the Philippines, the EPRA is an important step toward recognizing the land and cultural rights of indigenous peoples. However, they continued threats posed by mining operations and militarization highlight the need for stricter enforcement of these laws. Efforts like empowering indigenous communities to defend their ancestral domains and preserving their cultural heritage are vital to preventing the marginalization that can lead to conflict and violence. These strategies underscore the importance of proactive measures to address the root causes of genocide and build systems that fosters justice, education, and protection of the vulnerable groups. Conclusion: honoring the victims, securing a peaceful future. Genocide is devastating and all too common part of human history, but it is a tragedy that must never be repeated. By understanding the causes and impacts of genocide and working together to implement effective preventive strategies, we can honor the memory of those who have suffered and work towards a more just, equitable, and peaceful future for all. Through education diplomacy, accountability, and the protection of indigenous rights, we can strive to build a world where the horrors of genocide are consigned to the past. The conclusion also frames these strategies as not just solutions to prevent genocide, but as essential steps toward creating a world that values justice, equity, and peace. By ensuring the protection of human rights and fostering respect for diversity, society can honor the victims' memory and work toward a future where such tragedies never happen again. This reflects a vision of global solidarity and proactive governance, where past lessons guide us in building a safer, more inclusive,